This is a specific guide, The Hallucinogenic Plants of North America by Jonathan Ott. And the interesting thing about this is that it's pretty compendious, meaning there are things discussed here that you just won't find discussed anywhere else, probably because there are so few hallucinogenic plants in North America. This guy really had to scratch to produce a book about it. But this is useful for that. Similar but more broadly based is this book, Narcotic Plants. Terrible title, by William M. Bowden. But this book has a lot of visuals in it, and why I value this book is because he has a more liberal definition of psychoactivity than most people do. So consequently, his species lists are longer than anybody else's. So if somebody asks you about an obscure plant, is it psychedelic or not, this is where I look first, because he seems to list many things that nobody else has ever discussed. His name is spelled E-M-B-O-D-E-N, William M. Bowden. And he teaches, I think, at Riverside. I'm not sure, but some of you may know him. I don't. Then here's another one of these anthologies of writing about psychedelics, also by the same author as Flesh of the Gods, Hallucinogens and Culture, by Peter First. And again, this has articles on mushrooms, on the discovery of LSD, on ayahuasca, on cannabis and tobacco, the biochemistry of consciousness, shamanism as the religion, so forth and so on. Seems like every one of these authors then goes on to edit a book of their own favorite essays. Here's another one, Hallucinogens, Cross-Cultural Perspectives by Marlene Dobkin de Rios, who is a woman who's done a great deal of work on ayahuasca, published a book called The Visionary Vine, and I think another book called Ayahuasca, Mestizo Curing in an Urban Setting. Basically a sociologist, also I think at, she's at Fullerton, Cal State Fullerton. Yes, her first name is Marlene, M-A-R-L-E-N-E. Her last name is Dobkin de Rios, D-O-B-K-I-N space D-E space R-I-O-S. This book is published by the University of New Mexico Press. And then this is sort of the granddaddy of all of these anthologies. A very interesting book, hard to get, but fascinating. It's called The Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. And it was the name of a conference that was given in San Francisco in 1967. And the plan at the time of the conference was to have it occur every year. But it never occurred again because, of course, everything was made illegal the next year, and this faltered. But to show you how, to what degree the government was of two minds about psychedelics, it says on the frontispiece of this book, sponsored by the Pharmacology Section, Psychopharmacology Research Branch, National Institute of Mental Health, United States Public Health Service, U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. So it was published at government expense. This is, in fact, a technical publication of the National Institute of Mental Health. And wonderful bibliography, extremely interesting discussion of DMT-containing snuffs, article on the psychopharmacology of nutmeg that you just won't find anywhere else, articles on kava, more unopened mail, and an article on the history of research into psychedelic plants that goes clear back to the medieval herbalists. The title is The Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. The last time we were in the Amazon, we christened our expedition in honor of this book, The Ethnopharmacologic Search for Cold Beer. Because there ain't any, and it becomes an obsession. I mean, when you go, it's so strange what you miss. I mean, I don't even drink beer, so what do I care? After 10 days in the jungle, all anybody could talk about was the possibility of cold beer, and it was still 4 weeks away. So then, for somebody who really is serious or technical or plotting an expedition or plotting a research project of some sort, this is really a pretty amazing book. I mean, it's dull as death because it's essentially simply listings from the herbarium sheets at the Harvard Museum Botanical Library. It was put together by Siri von Reis-Atschul, who was one of Schulte's graduate students, and along with Ara de Mar de Rosienne and Marlene Dobkin de Rios, some of the few women who have made significant contributions to this field when it was firmly in the hands of dominator male types. Anyway, this book is called Drugs and Foods from Little-Known Plants, and they're not whistling Dixie when they say little-known plants. And a typical entry reads something like this. Let me see what genus we're in here. 2510, Maria Beringo, Panama, Gilbert White, collection number 71, 1938, called Sigella, claimed to be poisonous. All we know about this plant. Its folk name, its scientific name, claimed to be poisonous. Next entry, 2511, Maria Cessiflora, Honduras, collected by Junker, Dawson, and Hughes, collection number 5554, 1936, fruit reported edible when ripe. All we know. And you look through this, and some say hallucinogen or reported hallucinogen. But this touches foods. One of the things, it's not part of our concern here, but one of the things that's so frustrating when you do ethnobotany is to realize that people can be starving in environments where there are many food plants, but they don't utilize the food plants because they've accepted the values of a capitalist economy, and because the foods cannot be trucked to market or have a short shelf life, they're called pig food, and nobody will eat it. I mean, time and time in the tropics, I would come upon a plant that I knew to be edible and proteinaceous. Say to your informant or your guide, what's the story on this? It's food for pigs. People don't eat it. But, you know, they're buying canned, tinned tuna fish and spam from the priests at the mission. So this is a way in which people's folk lore and folk heritage is distorted. Anyway, Harvard University Press, Sri von Reis-Atschul. Then book by a good friend of mine, and if any of you are interested in ayahuasca or plan on going to South America where you may encounter ayahuasca, this book, Vegetalismo, Shamanism Among the Mestizo Population of the Peruvian Amazon. And this is a lovely book. This is about the people that I spent most of my field work time with, and you just cannot read this book without coming away with a sense of the depth and complexity of the ayahuasca worldview. It's healing classifications, the power allies, the admixture plants, the magical songs. It's by Luis Eduardo Luna, who I know has lectured and shown his films here at CIIS. He's an excellent person, a very good friend of mine. To my mind, probably the person doing the best anthropological work on ayahuasca in the world right now. The publisher, in case you want to try and track this down, is Almqvist, ALMQVIST, and Vilksell International, Stockholm. So it's a Swedish publisher. If any of you are just dying to have this book, order it from Lux Natura. We have 3 copies left, and this is not one of them, so don't try and buy this one from me. Well, I don't know if anybody actually wants them. Do you want them? It's a $20 item. Okay, I'll bring them, and you guys can fight over it and decide what you want to do. And then this is the last one that I was going to mention, because this could have been the title of our weekend. This is Psychedelic Drugs Reconsidered by Lester Grinspoon and James Bacalar. Lester Grinspoon managed to find his way into Herb Caen as a name freak when he published a monograph on the dangers of excessive cocaine use. Truth. Grinspoon and James Bacalar, also of Harvard. And basically, this is a very reasoned presentation of why psychedelics should be reconsidered for therapy, the case for them, the case against them, the nature of the hysteria that placed them off limits. He has also written Marijuana Reconsidered, and is a very nice person and leading the fight to decriminalize drugs for research. So that's all the books that I brought in to show you. They are, as I say, by no means all. The only resource that I would mention for the serious student of these things that I didn't bring in is nobody should try and deal with this subject without being aware of what's called the Harvard Museum Botanical Leaflets. And these are a series of leaflets that have been published since the 30s by the Peabody Museum in Boston. So write to the Boston Museum Botanical Garden, say you want a list of the leaflets, and they cost between $1 and $4 a piece, and they deal all of Schulte's papers, all kinds of very hard to recover information is available there. And the list, there are about 180 of these reprints on all aspects of all psychedelics and some non-psychedelics as well. So it's important to have this information and to have it at your fingertips. People, the compartmentalization between areas of knowledge that impinge on this always amazes me. I mean, you get psychologists who don't know what an MAO inhibitor is. You get people combining things without knowing how drug synergies work. You get people, just not informing themselves on the importance of setting, dosage, psychic predisposition, so forth and so on, all vital matters that can impinge on how an experience develops. And if you will take the time to inform yourself, you will feel much more sure of what you're doing, and that in itself can alleviate confusion and negative reactions. Well, so then I thought what I would do is sort of go around the world and talk about these things a little to give you an idea of what is available, what's on the menu. And then we'll take a little break, a very short break, and then come back and talk about it.
Can I ask one?
Sure, absolutely.
Did I hear you correctly that the liquid DMSO drinking 5 to 7 ounces a day for 5 days precipitates a psychedelic experience?
No, did I say DMSO?
That's why I was one clarification. Is it DMSO?
No, it isn't DMSO. If I said that, I didn't mean to. It's dimethylacetamide.
Oh, I thought you said sulfoxide.
I may have said sulfoxide. Dimethylacetamide. And I can show you or here, you just, while I'm raving, you just look it up in there, find it, and satisfy yourself.
Terence?
Yeah.
Before you start, could you explain the difference between psychoactive, psychotropic, and psychedelic? Because I don't understand what they mean.
Yeah, if I can. Psychoactive means exactly what it implies, that you can detect this compound as a higher cortical experience. That's all. I mean, to my mind, a higher cortical experience is a shift of mood, depression, elation, acute hearing, sensitivity to noises. All of these things could be classed as psychoactive reactions to a compound. Psychotropic is a word that I've never been very fond of, and it sort of came in late. Psychedelic, which is a fairly maligned word, but was coined by the psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, means simply mind manifesting. And I like that because it's phenomenologically neutral. Now, some people have tried to push the word entheogen for these things, meaning literally God-inducing. But to my mind, this carries a huge amount of ideological freight that we may not wish to buy into. I mean, maybe it's God-inducing, maybe it isn't. But psychedelic, meaning mind-manifesting, is pretty good. And then if all of these make you uncomfortable, you can just fall back on a completely phenomenological description and call them consciousness-expanding drugs. But there are drugs that I would not, for instance, I certainly don't consider alcohol a psychedelic, but clearly a psychoactive.
What about MDMA or marijuana?
Well, marijuana is one of these things that's so widely variant, both in how people react to it and how strong it can be. I would call MDMA a psychoactive drug, not a psychedelic drug. And then I use the word hallucinogen a lot. And a lot of people don't like that, even people in the field, and say, well, hallucinogen seems to imply that it's an illusion. But not, in my mind, I don't hear that. I'm fascinated by hallucinations. I mean, to me, that is the sine qua non that you're getting somewhere. I guess because it's just my philosophical biases. But a hallucination, it's such an extraordinary concept, isn't it? To see something which isn't there. And I don't mean to misread a surface so that you think it sticks into the room, which in fact sticks out of the room or something. I mean seeing something that is not there. And then that divides into two classes. Seeing an ordinary object, which is not there. And I think this is what most people think a hallucination is. Here is a bicycle. Is it real or not? The drug-crazied victim cannot tell. But most hallucinations are of things which can only be hallucinations, because that's what they are, you know. And so they have this aura of the unexpected and the other and the intrusive alienness. people have claimed to me that they have seen objects which are not there, which are completely ordinary. That is more typical of accounts of datura users, people who take high molecular weight tropanes, such as occur in Jimson weed and those kind of things. But my brief experimentation with that is it is what I call a deliriant rather than a psychoactive. I mean, when you take datura, you are so messed up that you literally lose all discrimination. Yeah, belladonna. You can't tell exactly where you are. You can't tell thinking about being somewhere from being there. Well, you're in no shape to undertake a spiritual quest if you're that discombobulated. So what I like are the things which do not destroy what I call core functions. In other words, there is still an evidence-gathering, observing mind left intact, and the disruption of perceptual input, if you want to put it that way, is pretty much confined to the visual cortex and then to the metaphor-forming capacity that is relating to the visual cortex. But I don't like things which confuse you, which impair judgment.
What about sativa divinorum?
Salvia divinorum. Well, that's that's an obscure one about which not much is known, although in the past year they've learned the absolute chemical characterization of the psychoactive compound, which is called salvorine alpha. More work has to be done. Anthropologists who have taken it with Indians in Oaxaca describe a very intense experience. When we grew it in Hawaii and took it exactly the way these people said to do it, it was an experience, but it was not clear whether it was psychedelic or merely so physiologically active in such a complex way that you couldn't tell exactly what was going on. The impression, which was not mine, but Katz and a beloved dean, they both experienced flow. They described the experiences as though you were lying in a dirty ditch with this cold fluid flowing from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet, and where this kind of cold, clammy fluid encountered energy obstructions in your body, it would wash them away. But it was a kind of vertigo with nausea, it was a complex experience, but it was not largely mental. It was more a revisioning of the body image. And, this is another one of these things where no research has been done. It isn't illegal, salvia divinorum, but you're not going to do your career any good to get tangled up with this. So consequently, it's pretty much left alone. Salvorine alpha is extremely unstable and breaks down within 12 hours. So that indicates it's probably a polyhydric alcohol or an isoquinone or something like that. It's not an indole. Yeah.
I was curious, and Watson talks about entheogens versus hallucinogens, and he's really against the word hallucinogen.
Yeah, he's the one who proposed entheogen.
Entheogen, right. And so, because his theory was, I guess, that he thought that a hallucination was something that wasn't there completely. And he thought that the experience on the soma, or the mushroom, was something that you actually are experiencing, so it's not a hallucination, it's real.
Yeah, that was what he said. But if you actually look at the etymology of the word hallucination, what it's come to mean in English is a delusion. A delusion. But what it really means in the original language is to wander in the mind. That's the meaning of hallucination, to wander in the mind. Well, that's a pretty good operational description of what's happening. And then when you add in the visual component, I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine how someone could undervalue hallucinations if they had had them.
Yeah, it sounds like it was reacting to the 60s hoopla a lot, the hoopla over LSD and the misreading of what these experiences really were, too.
Well, these guys were very frustrated with seeing this thing turned into a social hysteria. And Wasson, at times expressed great unhappiness with Tim Leary's approach and hated going to Mexico and seeing these mushroom villages invaded by graffiti-covered vans of filthy freaks from Southern California who were disrupting the local ecology. And it was a kind of proprietary approach. This thing belongs to anthropologists, to specialists. Wasson was very reticent to assess his own work. Some of you may have seen Bob Forte's interview with him in that psychedelic issue of Revision, where Forte asks him, how do you assess the historical impact of your work? And he said, I'll leave that to others to decide. He didn't want to deal with the question of the potential impact on his own society. He really looked at it as this exotic, foreign kind of thing. These guys were cautious, this first generation. Hoffman, Wasson, Schultes. These guys are not stoners by any means. I mean, their approach is cautious, and the psychedelic experiences can be counted on the fingers of one hand in a lifetime. So I'm not sure they ever realized the size of the tiger whose tail they had seized. Yeah.
The DMT and the frog, whatever it is, how is that extracted? I mean, how that frog slime or whatever it is?
Toad.
Yeah, right. Okay, now I want to know about that.
Well, I haven't had the good fortune to be present at the milking. So I really couldn't say, but as I gather, you put pressure on the back of the neck in two places, and this exudate emerges. Exactly where, I'm not sure, and probably decency should scarcely inquire. And then it's dried on sheets of glass and scraped up and packaged and so forth. Well, let me start through this and give you a notion of what is available. Whenever you talk about the distribution and cultural usage of hallucinogens, the first thing that you come up against is a curious, unsolved problem in botany, which is no one knows why this is, and we would be grateful if somebody could figure it out. But for unknown reasons, there is a tremendous concentration of psychoactive plants on the South American continent. The South American continent has more known hallucinogens than the rest of the planet combined. Now, why is this? After all, the climax tropical rainforests of eastern Indonesia are at least as species-rich as the Amazon basin, and yet not a single powerful hallucinogen is known with certainty from the old world tropics. All kinds of suggestions have been made that actually there are psychedelic plants common throughout the tropics of the old world, but the cultures have lost contact with them and forgotten them, and hence our anthropologists have not discovered them. Or something in the soil of South America. Very improbable theory. I was talking about this once in a workshop, and somebody raised their hand and said, well, no problem. Obviously, that's where the spaceships landed. Good. Well, we've solved that problem. Now we can move on. North America is extraordinarily poor in hallucinogens, perhaps the poorest of all continents, so that the psychedelic phobia that Europe created against paganism was completely reinforced, or at least not eroded, by the colonization of the New World, or of North America, because there were no plants here to challenge that. The North American Indians tend to ordeal as a shamanic vehicle, the sun dance thing, some of you may be familiar with, or sonic driving, which is worldwide in shamanically oriented cultures without drugs. You should know that not everyone agrees with me that psychedelics are the sine qua non of shamanism. That's what Wasson thought, that you don't have shamanism unless you have psychedelics. If you have people calling themselves shamans and not using psychedelics, then they are cut off from the older level of tradition, and through ritual, drumming, ordeals, starvation, flagellation, they are creating near psychedelic or pseudo-psychedelic states. Now, a brilliant and respected commentator on comparative religion like Mircea Eliade, who I quote whenever it suits my purpose, totally disagreed with this and said no, what he called narcotic shamanism, which means psychedelic shamanism, the choice of the word tells you that the guy had a problem. Narcotic shamanism is decadent shamanism, and the flagellation, the starvation, the ordeals, and the drumming, that's the real shamanism. And it's only when the tradition is abandoned and decadent that a culture will turn to drugs. I maintain this is nothing more than, he was a Romanian who became an academic in Paris. I maintain that this is nothing more than his Western cultural bias operating. Also in his youth, he was pretty infatuated with yoga. They will insist to you, that drugs are an inferior path. However, any of you who are scholars of yoga should know that all yoga is based on the Yogic Sutras of Patanjali, 2nd century BC Hindu Vedic commentator. And Patanjali specifically says there are 3 paths to the goal of yoga, and they are control of the breath, control of posture, and light-filled herbs. Says it right there. Stanza 6 of the Yogic Sutra of Patanjali. It's never discussed again, basically, in the entire exegesis of the yogic literature. The 3rd path is never mentioned. Well, is that because it's a secret tradition or what? I don't know. When you go to India seeking these yogins, practicing these higher yogas, what you find are a bunch of guys smoking as much charas as they possibly can. And the notion that you could do it without that, it just gets a long laugh from everybody down around the burning ghats. I mean, they deal with it on a practical level. Okay, moving out of drug-impoverished North America, or psychedelic-impoverished North America, where there are more than 20 species of indigenous psilocybin-containing mushrooms, but, and this is interesting, no evidence whatsoever for tribal or traditional usage. In other words, in this Northwest Coast Indian complex, the Shimsham, Tlingit, Nootka group, no reason to believe, other than our own predilection for romantic fantasy, that these people were using mushrooms in pre-contact times, and yet the mushrooms were there. The complex that we're most familiar with as a North American hallucinogen is in the southwest of the United States, peyote, Lophophora williamsi, the peyote cactus. Now, the interesting thing here is we cannot find archaeological evidence of peyote use that is particularly ancient. Peyote use in the Southwest appears to be less than 500 years old. Before that, what we find in Indian graves of the Tarahumara and so forth are the seeds of Sephora secundifolia. Sephora secundifolia is a highly poisonous legume that contains cysteine. This is an example of what we call not a psychedelic, but an ordeal poison. Now, in certain parts of the world, this approach to spiritual growth has been taken, most notably on the island of Madagascar, off the coast of eastern Africa. What is an ordeal poison? This is a plant where you take it and you are so convinced that you're dying that you have an experience of self-abandonment, getting straight, surrender, and then you live, and you're fine, but you are absolutely convinced that you're dying. Your heart pounds or fibrillates, or you convulse, or you fall into deep coma, or you have tetanus in the limbs, whatever it is, and then you recover. Well, anybody can tell you this is a kind of psychedelic experience because you're so damn glad you lived that you see everything in a new light. You can be kind to your children and love your wife and tolerate your relatives. And people say, well, it made a new man out of him. Well, yes, because he came so close to dying that he shed neurotic behavior patterns. But this is not a true psychedelic. So what we're assuming is that about 500 or 1,000 years ago, sometime in that span, the Sephora cult was replaced by the peyote cult, which came from a much smaller usage area. Then also in Southern California, there were what were called the Tolach religions of datura, intoxication, initiation of young men by intoxicating them with datura and leaving them in the wilderness to fend for themselves. Again, this comes close to being an ordeal poison, although it also has psychoactive properties, but so confusing, such a deliriant, that it bears no relationship to the true hallucinogens, which, with the exception of mescaline, I believe all fall into the category of the indoles. Now, mescaline is not an indole, it's an amphetamine, closely related to MDA and MDMA, but it is a true hallucinogen at fairly high doses. The indoles, which are this structurally related small family, they seem to me to be the true visionary ecstatogens. And I will mention as I go through the list which ones are indoles and which ones are not.
You mean which ones are amphetamines?
Well, no, the only one which is an amphetamine is mescaline, so we needn't...
So you have indole and non-indole.
Indole and non-indole. A kind of parallel phenomenon to the peyote cult of the Southwest is in the deserts of northwestern Peru. There are very large columnar cacti in the genus Trichoceros that contain mescaline. And they have been used for a long time, a lot longer than peyote. We have mocha ceramic dated to before 1000 BC, which show, in fact, doesn't somebody wearing, yes, this gentleman has the T-shirt. This is a Peruvian design. Point out yes, that's the chunk of San Pedro being held by this dwarf-like little demon. This is a fang demon, mocha design, 1,500 years old. Now, in central Mexico, we come upon the first of these large centers of hallucinogenic use. In the cultural area in which the Olmec arose, were subsequently succeeded by the Maya, who were subsequently subjugated by the Toltecs. And the plants that were in use in those situations fall into two pretty well-defined categories. First of all, psilocybin-containing mushrooms of several species, and second of all, morning glories of at least two types, convolvulaceae, which contain LSD-like alkaloids active in the milligram range that are highly visionary. And there's considerable evidence in the Codex Vindobonensis and in some of the Mayan ceramics that this was a culture that made a very important place for hallucinogens, and that it was the privilege of the priestly class, and that their obsession with calendrics and astronomy and this sort of thing was also somehow intimately connected to their interest in the psilocybin mushrooms. And again, one of these botanical puzzles. Here is a cluster of 10 or 15 species in central Mexico of mushrooms, and a culture builds itself around them. A similar cluster of species on the northwest coast, the culture seems to totally ignore it and have no use for it. And nowhere else on Earth are there clusters of species of psilocybin mushrooms with a long history of use. Naturally, the export of cattle throughout the warm tropics has allowed the coprophytic mushrooms, the mushrooms which grow on manure, to be spread throughout the warm tropics. And then in places like England and France, you get the occurrence of the diminutive psilocybin mushrooms, Lanciata. But again, only the most unconvincing evidence of traditional use. I mean, I am Irish, Celtic. I would love to have somebody come up with a bunch of evidence that ancient Celtic and Druidic art and magic was somehow related to mushrooms. But to date, the efforts have been unconvincing to any skeptic. It may still be there. Perhaps in heraldic vices, someone should go back and study the escutcheons of the families of medieval Europe. And you do find, for instance, the Morel family, Morelli, noble Italian family, mushrooms on the family coat of arms, and other families in France whose names escape me. Elise Agar. Yeah, although that is a coincidence, not
well,
a
I mean, not
historical.
yeah, but still, that name.
Will the Sergeant at Arms. Okay, so, let me say something a little bit more about the Morning Glory complex, because it's very interesting. LSD, discovered by Albert Hofmann in 1937 and so forth, comes from ergot, comes from an organism called claviceps, or Claviceps paspali, which is a smut which grows on ergot, a humbler organism. You could hardly imagine. I mean, this is basically yuck, is how you would describe this organism if you were to come upon it. It looks like a mistake, because it's just an amorphous, slimy black mess growing on certain cereal grains. And one of the fascinating questions to these chemists, once they discover a new compound, is to try and figure out, does it occur anywhere else in nature? Some plants, some fish, some something, and then you can form theories and judgments about evolutionary relationships. So Albert Hofmann, the discoverer of LSD, was amazed when carrying out analytical work for Gordon Wasson on magic morning glory seeds that had been sent to Wasson from Schultes. He discovered the same compounds, or very closely related compounds, as he had synthesized to make LSD. I'm going to slightly jump around here now and say that in India, there are 13 species of